The first time I rewired a router, I was 13 and grounded, not for anything serious, just for talking back when I questioned why my younger brother got new sneakers while I patched mine with duct tape. I spent that Saturday afternoon in the garage, sitting cross-legged on a dusty old rug next to a pile of electronics my father called junk. He didn't know I'd been sneaking tech magazines from the library, teaching myself the difference between a chipset and a firewall. I wanted to understand how things worked, how data moved, how systems failed, how I could control them. I'm about to share something personal, but first, drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how many hearts this story can touch. By dinner, I had split open the casing, soldered in a replacement capacitor from a discarded motherboard, and routed a signal strong enough to reach our attic. My brother, lounging upstairs on his iPad, thought the Wi-Fi just magically fixed itself. When I tried to explain what I'd done, my father didn't look up from his steak. "Interesting hobby," he muttered. Then, as if on cue, he turned to my brother. "How was your soccer scrimmage, son?" It was always like that. I didn't get grounded for breaking rules. I got grounded for reminding them I didn't fit. In our house, business acumen came in khakis and PowerPoint decks, not circuit boards and code. My mother, a former accountant turned full-time hostess of my father's business dinners, told me to keep my skills quietly impressive. That meant not threatening. So I learned to build in silence. Old VCRs became parts bins. I collected busted gadgets like other kids collected phone cases. I spent lunch periods in the computer lab, fixing the IT teacher's drivers in exchange for admin access. It wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. There was nowhere else to put the ambition. At 14, I built a basic firewall that could detect packet injection attempts and auto-log them in real time. I was proud of it. I showed my father the command line interface one night, hoping, naively, that this time he'd see it for what it was. He scanned the screen, frowned, and said, "Don't let this distract you from practical skills." Then he poured himself a scotch and started telling my brother about the real business world. I stopped showing him things after that, but I didn't stop building. They thought ignoring me would discourage me. What they didn't understand was that rejection wasn't a wall, it was a spark. Every dismissal added fuel, every condescending smile, every rerouted compliment, every "that's nice, but your brother" was stored somewhere deep, waiting. It would take years, but that garage, that rewired router, that silence, that's where it started. When Jason was born, my father looked like a man who had finally received the heir he'd been waiting for. I was 5, still learning to tie my shoes and recite multiplication tables, but already old enough to recognize the shift. I went from being our brilliant little girl to background noise. Jason cried through dinner? I should be more patient. Jason knocked over my science project? He's just curious, sweetheart. Jason breathed in a room, and the light turned toward him. By the time we were teenagers, the difference wasn't just felt, it was documented. My straight A's were met with quiet nods, and the occasional, "keep it up." Jason's participation trophy in 8th grade baseball earned him a steak dinner and a framed photo on Dad's office shelf. I once came home ecstatic, holding a regional robotics award. My father glanced at the plaque, then turned back to his laptop. "You hear back about Jason's project in econ yet?" he asked, as if my win was a prelude to his real child's accomplishments. It wasn't blatant. That was the brilliance of it. No one ever said, "Jason matters more." It was more insidious than that. It was Dad's instinct to involve him in conversations about stocks and strategy, while I was asked to set the table. It was how my mother would hand me the guest list for family dinners, while Jason got a seat at the grown-ups' end, laughing like he belonged there. When I asked to join their conversation once, Dad chuckled and said, "Let your brother handle the business talk." Jason wasn't cruel. That was part of the problem. He was charming, agreeable, even sweet in a vacant sort of way. He believed he was a natural leader because everyone had always treated him like one. He called me the genius in front of guests, but somehow that word always landed like a backhanded compliment, an exception, not a rule. He coasted on the assumption that things would work out, that someone, Dad, the universe, would make sure doors stayed open. I built ladders. He walked through open gates. In high school, he was voted most likely to succeed. I was told I was too intense. When I corrected a teacher in front of the class with better code, I was labeled difficult. When Jason flubbed a presentation and smiled through it, the teacher said he had natural charisma. By then, I understood the rules. His potential was praised before it existed. Mine had to prove itself again and again, and even then, it was treated as a pleasant surprise. At home, I was the footnote in Jason's biography. They were writing his legend in real time. I was expected to applaud from the margins. I didn't. I watched. I waited. And I remembered. The MIT envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of cold, gray Pacific Northwest afternoon where everything feels heavier. I stood in the front hallway clutching it, heart in my throat, fingers trembling. When I opened it and saw the word congratulations, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at it, stunned. I had worked for this. Years of perfect grades, nights spent debugging code while the house slept, weekends filled with competitions instead of parties. It wasn't just a letter. It was proof. I had earned my way into one of the hardest schools in the world. At dinner that night, I slid the letter across the table. MIT, I said, trying to sound calm. My mother's face lit up. That's wonderful, darling. My father raised his eyebrows, gave a half smile, and said, Impressive. Then he turned to Jason. You think you'll still go with Wharton or look closer to home? Jason shrugged. Still deciding. Dad, can we go over that portfolio thing later? That was it. My moment passed like a cloud. No toast, no follow-up, no talk of logistics or excitement. Just a nod and back to business as usual. A few weeks later, I brought home the financial aid breakdown. MIT was expensive, and even with scholarships, there was a gap. I laid out a spreadsheet, grants, scholarships, work-study projections, and said, if the family could help with this part, just a little, I can make it work. My father didn't even look at the paper. State schools are perfectly adequate, he said, spearing a piece of chicken. No need to rack up debt for a fancy name. I didn't cry. I said thank you, cleared the dishes, and filled out 5 more scholarship applications that night. A year later, Jason graduated high school with a B- average, a padded resume from student council, and a charming personal essay about leadership. When he got into a mid-tier business school, my father threw a garden party. There were custom-printed cocktail napkins that said, Reynolds' legacy continues. My mother bought him new luggage. Tutors appeared, unasked for. Housing was paid in full, so was tuition. I watched from a distance, a blurry Zoom face at the edge of the screen when my parents called him to congratulate his big future. No one ever asked how I was doing juggling calculus-heavy course loads and 2 part-time jobs. No one noticed the nights I coded until dawn, eating dollar ramen under flickering dorm lights, calculating just how far I could stretch a campus meal plan. It wasn't the money that stung, it was the clarity. Jason was an investment. I was a risk. But risks learn to carry themselves. Risks learn to build alone. And when risks finally pay off, no one else gets to cash the check. The idea came during a group project no one wanted to lead. It was senior year at MIT, capstone season, and everyone in my team had 1 foot out the door. Resumes polished, job offers pending, already dreaming in stock options. Our assignment was vague. Design a system that addressed a real-world digital security issue. One guy suggested a password manager. Another wanted to build a threat detection chatbot. I listened, chewing the inside of my cheek, then finally said, what if we stop patching vulnerabilities and start synchronizing protocols across platforms instead? They stared at me like I'd just asked to rewrite the internet. Cross-platform security sync isn't feasible, someone said. Latency issues, bandwidth load? Not if you compress at the transport layer, I replied. Not if you rethink how the handshake works. They blinked. Then one of them said, "Okay, you lead it." So I did. For the next 6 weeks, I stopped sleeping like a student and started living like a founder. I skipped meals. I missed calls from my mother. I ignored a text from Jason that just said, "You still doing nerd stuff?" Because I couldn't afford the detour. I filled a notebook with equations and sketches, rewrote existing encryption protocols in cleaner, lighter code, tested latency across simulations with aggressive packet injection. The more the system failed, the more I knew I was onto something. Weak ideas fall apart quietly. This one broke loud. By the 4th week, I had a skeleton prototype running. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Data moved securely between simulated systems faster than existing benchmarks. My classmates, to their credit, helped document and present it. On demo day, we stood before a panel of professors and tech executives while I walked them through the architecture. I expected polite interest. Instead, they asked for a copy of the white paper. 2 stayed after to ask how I solved the time lag issue. One of them, a visiting CTO from a mid-sized firm, said, "This could be a product." That night, I didn't go to the after-party. I stayed in my dorm room, staring at my terminal window and tweaking line after line of code. I renamed the file Sync Secure V0.1. I didn't know what it would become, not yet, but I knew this wasn't just a class project. It was something bigger, something mine. I never told my father about the prototype. I knew the tone he'd take. "Sounds ambitious," he'd say, in that careful way he spoke when he didn't want to sound discouraging, but couldn't hide the doubt. Jason would have joked that I was inventing something only 8 people on Earth understand. And maybe I was. But those 8 people would change everything, and I intended to be one of them. It was a Saturday night in late May, the kind of evening where everything looks golden if you squint. My parents had reserved a table at a sleek new seafood place downtown. Celebrating success, my mother called it. I'd just finished my capstone presentation at MIT and flown home that morning, exhausted but proud. The prototype worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was mine. I didn't expect a banner or balloons, just something. Jason arrived 15 minutes late, hair gelled, sleeves rolled just enough to show his watch. He'd just wrapped up a 10-week internship at a commercial real estate firm Dad had connections with. He called it a learning experience. He'd spent most of it shadowing a guy named Gary and updating spreadsheets. Still, the moment he sat down, my father beamed. "How was the final week, son?" he asked. Jason grinned. "They let me sit in on a client pitch. Gary said I've got natural deal instincts." My dad chuckled, pleased, then launched into a toast about the next generation of Reynolds leadership. My mother clinked her glass. Jason took a long sip of wine he wasn't old enough to order himself. I waited. A beat. 2. Then I cleared my throat. "I presented our prototype to a panel of tech execs," I said. 2 of them asked to see the code base. My mother smiled politely. "That's lovely, dear." My father nodded once. "Well, real-world feedback is always useful." "Actually," I said, forcing calm, "one of them said it could be commercialized, that the sync architecture could fill a major market gap." Jason forked another piece of halibut. "That's cool. You gonna sell it to Google or something?" "I'm thinking of developing it myself," I said. "As a product. A company." My dad set down his knife. "A company," he said. "Startups are a gamble, Catherine. That's not a decision to make lightly. I've run the numbers. There's a real path." He didn't even look at me. "A lot of smart kids come out of college thinking they're the next big thing. It's rarely that simple." I stared at him, the salmon on my plate untouched. "So Jason can run spreadsheets and he's got deal instincts, but I build an actual functioning prototype that 2 CTOs ask to see, and that's not enough?" Jason shifted uncomfortably. My mother frowned. "This isn't a competition," she said. Of course it was. It always had been. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my old twin bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, and made a quiet decision. They didn't have to see it. They didn't have to believe in it. The fire had already started. They'd just poured gasoline on it. Let them toast to Jason. I'd build my own table. The resignation letter sat in my drafts for 3 days before I hit send. Not because I was unsure, I'd made the decision weeks ago, but because I needed a moment to mourn the version of me who still cared about playing it safe. Prism Technologies paid well, came with a skyline view, stock options, and praise that always stopped just short of meaningful. "You're a rising star," my director liked to say, smiling like he meant it, before handing off my ideas to someone higher up the chain. I wasn't quitting because I hated the job. I was quitting because I couldn't stand the slow erosion of ambition. Every day I stayed, the idea sat quietly in the back of my mind, like an unopened box marked someday. But someday had teeth. It gnawed at me during late-night commutes and quiet moments over coffee. It whispered things like, "What if you're right? And what if you build it before someone else does?" So I sent the letter. No fanfare, no speech, just a polite exit email and a firm last day. My manager was surprised, but not shocked. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm starting something," I said. He blinked. "You mean freelance?" "No, a company." He gave me the kind of smile people reserve for toddlers in oversized shoes. "That's brave." Brave. The polite corporate synonym for naive. I packed up my desk into a single box, a few notepads, a desk plant, a half-finished whiteboard sketch I didn't bother erasing. I walked out through the revolving doors of the building I'd once been so proud to enter and stepped into sunlight that felt unnaturally bright. It was early spring, the air still sharp, and I had no salary, no funding, no safety net, just a rented one-bedroom apartment with patchy heat and a prototype that existed mostly in my head. I gave myself 6 months. That's what my savings would cover if I lived carefully. No dinners out, no new anything, and ramen only on sale. I turned my second bedroom into a workspace. One wall became a whiteboard, the other a graveyard of sticky notes with things like compression priority and redundant path auto recovery scrawled in Sharpie. I coded until my wrists ached, and then I coded more. The apartment became a cave of caffeine, algorithms, and quiet terror. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up sweating, heart racing, and wonder what the hell I thought I was doing. I'd stare at the ceiling and hear my father's voice. Startups are a gamble. I'd hear my manager's brave, and then I'd get up, make coffee, open the code, and keep building. Because the only thing scarier than betting on myself was not doing it at all. The apartment didn't even have a door between the bedroom and the kitchen, just a half wall that pretended to be separation. My desk was a salvaged dining table I'd found on Craigslist, wobbling slightly no matter how many folded receipts I stuffed under the leg. My monitor sat on 2 textbooks, Distributed Systems and Modern Cryptography. I liked the symbolism. This was my foundation now. Every day bled into night without ceremony. I worked in bursts, 12, 14 hours at a time, only stopping when my body threatened collapse. Meals were whatever I could make in under 5 minutes. Mostly ramen, occasionally eggs if I remembered to buy them. I stopped checking the clock when I ate. I stopped checking the mirror, too. There were setbacks. Of course there were. A week in, the entire system collapsed under a stress test I thought it could handle. The error logs were brutal, line after line of red, pointing to architecture flaws I should have caught. I stared at the screen until the sun came up, fingers hovering above the keyboard, too exhausted to cry, too stubborn to quit. I fixed it. Or rather, I broke it better. And then I fixed it again. Sometimes I wondered how normal people lived. My college friends were posting vacation photos, announcing job promotions, getting engaged. Meanwhile, I hadn't worn real pants in 4 days and had full-on conversations with a rubber duck I kept on my desk to debug logic loops. I named him Chief Technical Therapist. He never interrupted. There were no employees, no board, no co-founder to split the panic with, just me, a half-working prototype, and the constant sound of the neighbor's dog barking through the paper-thin walls. Every time I saw a LinkedIn post about a founder crushing it in their first year, I wanted to laugh, or scream, or maybe both. I remember one night in particular, 2:13 a.m., I had hit another wall. Memory leaks I couldn't trace, a load balancer that refused to balance, and a creeping voice in my head that said you were stupid to leave Prism. I closed my laptop, laid flat on the floor, and stared up at the cracked ceiling. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed down on me. And yet, I didn't stop. Because even in that mess of code and isolation and uncertainty, I still believed in what I was building. I believed in a system that didn't exist yet but should. I believed that one day someone would look at what I'd made and say, "This solves something real." That belief was all I had. But sometimes belief is enough to keep going, even when you're building from nothing, especially then. It happened at 4:47 a.m. on a Thursday. I hadn't slept. My second mug of coffee had gone cold 2 hours earlier, and the cursor on my screen was blinking like it knew I was close. For days, I'd been staring at the same chunk of code, trying to make two systems talk to each other without tripping over latency walls or creating gaps wide enough for a high school hacker to crawl through. Cross-platform encryption wasn't new. But it was slow, or brittle, or both. Every solution I tested either introduced drag on data speed or compromised security. In most cases, it did both. I'd tried threading, I'd tried buffering. I'd even tried rerouting through cloud proxies, which felt like cheating and still didn't work. I was chasing a ghost. One that whispered, "It's possible," just loud enough to keep me from quitting. That night, or maybe it was morning, I realized I'd been solving the wrong part of the problem. Everyone was trying to protect the transport layer after it moved. I needed to pre-authorize encryption logic that could adapt before it transferred, like building a bridge that builds itself depending on the terrain ahead. Dynamic compression, pre-validated token authentication, conditional sync based on packet metadata. I rewrote the core logic in under 2 hours. And when I ran the test again, no warning errors, no latency spike, no security flag, just clean, fast, secure transmission. I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. I just stared at the screen, heart pounding, waiting for something to go wrong. I reran it with corrupted data. I reran it on a different OS. Still clean. Then I sent 2 platforms syncing in real time, each with layered encryption protocols, and watched as they adapted and completed the handshake under 300 milliseconds. I had built something new, not a patch, not a workaround, a rethinking of how encryption could be negotiated, fluidly, intelligently, without waiting for legacy systems to catch up. I named the protocol Core Flux. Just a working title, I told myself, but it stuck. I sat back in my chair, fingers shaking, and whispered, "Oh my God." It was the first time I said it out loud. This could actually work. I wrote everything down, structure, logic, fail-safes, then backed it up in 3 locations. After that, I just sat there, breathing. The sky outside was turning the soft gray blue of a city about to wake up. My neighbors were still asleep. My phone hadn't buzzed in hours. And no one knew that in this tiny, heat-starved apartment, something had just shifted. I didn't have funding, I didn't have clients, but I had Core Flux. I had the proof. And for the first time since I walked out of Prism, I didn't feel like I'd left something behind. I felt like I'd found it. I met Linda Harris at a Women in Tech networking event I almost didn't attend. I hadn't washed my hair in 2 days, and the idea of pretending to be on around people with shiny business cards and shinier shoes made my stomach turn. But the ticket was free, and the event promised wine and meaningful connections, which at that point, I was desperate enough to gamble on. I stood near the back, half listening to a panel discussion on inclusive hiring, when she walked in, tall, silver hair, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She didn't carry a tote bag or a branded notebook, just a small leather folder and the air of someone who didn't need to introduce herself. I knew the name. Everyone in cybersecurity knew the name. Linda Harris, the former CTO of Securitrust, one of the few women to lead a billion-dollar exit in the security space. A myth, basically. She ended up beside me at the bar. "Don't like panels?" she asked, dry smile. "I like them fine," I said. "Just not when they're sponsored by companies that keep hiring the same 5 guys named Brad." She laughed. Fair. I told myself not to pitch her. Not here, not over free Sauvignon Blanc in a dim hotel ballroom. But 5 minutes into the conversation, I found myself sketching out core flux on a cocktail napkin. I didn't talk about valuations or exit strategies. I talked about latency issues, dynamic protocol negotiation, and the way legacy platforms were dragging the entire industry backwards. She didn't nod politely. She interrupted with real questions. Tough ones. The kind only someone who'd lived in this space would know to ask. "Show me," she said before I could finish. "Tomorrow. My office." Her office was a quiet corner space in a converted warehouse overlooking the bay. No fancy furniture, just clean lines and functional tech. I set up the demo on her conference table, hands sweating, pretending I wasn't working on 3 hours of sleep and borrowed confidence. She watched in silence, asked for another run, then changed the input parameters mid-demo without warning. The system held, synced, adapted. She leaned back, arms crossed. "You built this alone?" I nodded. "It's raw," she said, "but the architecture is solid. You've solved the one problem everyone dances around and pretends is too hard." I waited. "How much do you need to get to MVP?" I told her. She nodded. "You've got it, on 2 conditions, mentorship and weekly check-ins." The number she wired to my account that afternoon wasn't huge by Valley standards, but to me it was life-altering. It meant breathing room. It meant validation. It meant someone finally saw what I saw. She didn't ask for a founder title, she didn't want control. She just believed, and sometimes that's the capital that matters most. I pitched Meridian Credit Union 7 times before they said yes. The first 3 were to people who couldn't make decisions. The next 2 were to people who didn't understand the tech. The 6th was to someone who clearly didn't want to be in the meeting and spent the entire time checking her watch. But the 7th, James Caro, their CIO, listened. Not politely, not impatiently, actually listened. He didn't flinch at the term adaptive sync protocol, didn't glaze over when I explained dynamic handshake layers. He asked about compliance windows, deployment timelines, redundancy metrics. He asked the kind of questions that told me he wasn't just looking for a vendor, he was looking for a solution. "Your system could actually get us audit ready in less than a month?" he asked, skeptical but curious. "If we start this week," I said. 3 weeks, maybe 2.5 if your infrastructure isn't a nightmare." He smirked. "It's a nightmare." I shrugged. I don't scare easy. The contract wasn't huge, but it was real. Real enough that I stared at the email for 5 straight minutes before believing it was actually signed. It came on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my pajamas, eating cereal with a fork because I was out of clean spoons. I didn't celebrate, not right away. I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and let myself just stand there. A client. A paying client. It wasn't a dream anymore. It wasn't a prototype or a napkin pitch. It was a deployed solution with a live environment and a deadline that meant working around the clock for the next 21 days. I called Marcus that afternoon. He'd been a lead systems architect at Prism, brilliant and underused, one of the few people who had ever treated me like an equal. We met at a dingy coffee shop on 8th, and I laid it all out. The project, the tech, the funding, the timeline. "You're asking me to leave a secure job to join a company with no office and 1 client," he said deadpan. "I'm also offering you CTO, equity, and the chance to build something the industry swears can't be done." He took a sip of his coffee. "Send me the specs." The next morning he called. "I'm in." We moved fast. My apartment became mission control. Marcus brought folding tables. I bought a second whiteboard. We lived on takeout and sheer willpower. There were bugs, crashes. One night, the system refused to deploy past 74%, and we stayed up until dawn rebuilding the container logic from scratch. But on day 21, the system went live. Stable, secure, fast. Meridian passed their compliance audit with 0 flags. James Caro called me afterward and said, "Whatever you're building, don't stop." I didn't. I couldn't. The team didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, like pieces of something I was building before I fully understood the shape. Marcus was first and easiest. He knew the code, knew me, knew what it meant to stay up all night chasing a glitch just because something about it felt off. After the Meridian rollout, he started showing up before I texted. He stopped referring to it as your company and started saying ours without ceremony. He never asked for confirmation. He just belonged. Next came Rachel Donovan. She'd run operations for a logistics startup that imploded spectacularly due to mismanagement and ego. She lasted longer than the founder. I remembered her from a panel we'd both sat on. She was the one who didn't speak much but asked the smartest question of the night. I found her on LinkedIn, sent a message, and 3 days later, we were eating stale muffins in a co-working space while I walked her through our roadmap. She didn't blink at the chaos. She opened her laptop and started asking about contracts, SLAs, documentation. She'd seen worse. She'd survived worse. And she had that rare calm that only comes from people who've held everything together with duct tape and still made payroll. "I'll clean up the back end," she said, standing to leave. "Don't tell me how you've been doing things. Just tell me where it hurts." Then came James, our first real engineer, recruited off a Reddit thread I posted at 2 a.m. He'd been working freelance, building tools that were smarter than the companies hiring him. His pull request on our open-source protocol was so elegant, it made me question my own logic. I called him immediately. "Why us?" I asked after he accepted. "I'm tired of building boring things for rich idiots," he said. "You're building something with teeth." And finally, Priya. She was still finishing her master's in network security when I met her at a university pitch night. Most of the students were fumbling through half-baked ideas about gamified education and social apps for dog owners. Priya stood up and calmly outlined a flaw in mobile payment encryption that no one else in the room even recognized. I offered her an internship. She asked for a salary. I respected that. We didn't have titles yet, or salaries that made sense. Half the team worked from folding chairs, the other half from couches that creaked when you breathed wrong. But we had Slack channels buzzing at 2 a.m., systems getting stronger by the hour, and something that felt like momentum. Every day someone said, "Wait, what if we..." And something better got built. We weren't a company yet. Not really. But we were becoming one. The night before the demo, I didn't sleep. Not from nerves exactly, though those were there, coiled tight beneath my ribcage, but because the code still wasn't perfect. I kept rewatching the recorded build, tweaking animations, adjusting the UI margins no one would notice but me. Marcus finally closed my laptop at 2:30 a.m., handed me a cup of mint tea and said, "Ship it. It's ready." We weren't even on the main stage. Our demo slot was mid-afternoon, third room to the left, nestled between a smart fridge startup and a guy trying to make AI dog collars. Still, the chairs filled fast. I spotted 2 people from the VC firm that had ghosted me 6 months earlier. One of them recognized me and nodded, like we were old friends. I walked on stage with a laptop that still had a sticker peeling off and a pit in my stomach that wouldn't go away. But when I clicked that first command and the interface loaded, smooth, responsive, clean, I felt something settle. "Imagine," I said, "a world where your security architecture doesn't lag 6 months behind your growth." I showed them the sync, real-time encryption negotiation, seamless integration, Core Flux adapting to new platforms like it already belonged there. They didn't clap right away, which scared me, until I saw the faces. People weren't smiling. They were frowning. leaning forward, taking notes. That kind of attention is rarer than applause. It meant they were listening to understand, not just to be impressed. The first question afterward came from a security consultant in the second row. "How the hell did you solve the latency handshake?" "Rebuilt the handshake," I said. "From scratch." Another man raised his hand. "Have you filed patents?" "4," I said. "Pending with provisional protection." Afterward, they didn't leave. They came up, one after another. People I'd looked up to, architects, founders, even a grizzled former NSA analyst who said, "I've been waiting for someone to do this for 20 years. It was the kind of praise I'd never gotten at home. Not the polite, head-tilted good-for-you kind. Real recognition. Earned. Undeniable. Linda was waiting off stage with a look I'd never seen on her before, half proud, half something sharper. "You're not under the radar anymore," she said. She was right. By the time I got back to my hotel, my inbox had 17 meeting requests. A journalist from a mid-tier tech publication had already written a piece. Small startup, big disruption. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding my demo clicker in one hand, and let it wash over me. Not validation, not really. More like confirmation. We weren't just building something useful, we were building something they couldn't ignore. The article had been live for 2 days when my father finally called. Not to congratulate me, he never did that, but to say, "Your mother showed me the piece, the one with your picture and that quote about, what was it, disruption?" I waited. "Cute project," he added, like he was describing a science fair entry instead of the software infrastructure that had just earned us a contract with a Fortune 500 client. "It's not a project," I said. "It's a company." "Well, sure, of course. I'm just saying, it's good experience. That's what these things are about." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't spiral. He filled the silence the way he always did, with unsolicited advice and thinly disguised dismissal. "Just don't lose sight of the big picture. You've always been intense, Catherine. But business is about more than just building things. It's about relationships, long games. You might consider bringing in someone with more, let's say, presence." Presence. I knew what that meant. The same thing it had always meant. Someone with a better handshake and a smoother laugh. Someone like Jason, who, coincidentally, had just posted on LinkedIn about entrepreneurial bloodlines, while casually tagging my company and referring to my sister's app thing. The caption ended with a wink emoji. When I texted him about it, just to say, "Maybe don't publicly misrepresent what you don't understand," he responded with, "Relax, just giving you free PR. You're welcome." This from a guy who once asked me what open source meant. At Christmas, he made a joke about my code being just glorified copy-paste. Everyone laughed, including my mother, who tried to soften it by saying, "He's just teasing, honey. He's proud of you, in his own way." Pride wasn't silence. Pride wasn't backhanded compliments and LinkedIn name-dropping. I'd spent years chasing approval that never came, confusing politeness for support, mistaking family obligation for interest. At Sunday dinner, my father asked if we were still doing the cyber thing. "Yes," I said, cutting into my overcooked chicken. "We just onboarded 3 enterprise clients, launched a beta for our predictive analytics module." He nodded vaguely. "Well, let's hope it turns into something real." It already had, but he didn't ask what that meant, didn't ask what we'd built or why major banks were replacing legacy systems to use it. Jason launched into a story about meeting someone at a networking event who might be starting a fund, and the conversation veered in his direction, as it always did. I sat back, let them talk. They didn't get it, and maybe they never would. But I'd stopped needing them to. They weren't the audience. Not anymore. The final Zoom call lasted 17 minutes. That was all it took. After months of pitch decks, technical deep dives, and cautious second looks, the partner at Vertex Ventures leaned back in his chair, smiled, and said, "We're in." Just like that. Like he was ordering lunch, not wiring $5 million into a startup run out of a converted warehouse with mismatched chairs and a caffeine problem. I didn't smile right away. I'd learned not to trust moments that came too easily. But when the term sheet hit my inbox 10 minutes later, clean, founder-friendly, and exactly what we'd asked for, I exhaled like I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath since last winter. I walked into our shared workspace, where Rachel and Marcus were arguing over a new feature release, and held up my phone. "They signed." Rachel blinked. "Vertex?" I nodded. Marcus let out a laugh, half disbelief, half relief. "You're serious?" "They wired $5 million, I said. "Pre-money valuation, 20. No one screamed. No one popped champagne. That would come later. Right then, we just sat there, the three of us, in plastic chairs surrounded by whiteboards covered in half-erased equations, and let it sink in. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was momentum. This was real. I texted Linda. "We closed. You were right. They saw it." She replied with 2 words. "Of course." We did celebrate that night. Nothing fancy, just pizza, cheap beer, and a badly tuned Bluetooth speaker blasting early 2000s pop in the corner of our office. People danced between workstations. Someone taped a handwritten sign to the wall that said, "Series A, baby." I sat on the edge of my desk watching them, our growing team, and thought, this is what it feels like to build something worth believing in. At some point, I stepped outside for air. The street was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the muffled bass from our office windows. My phone buzzed. It was my father. "I saw the announcement," he said, voice steady. "$5 million? That's not nothing." "No," I said. "It's not." There was a pause, long enough to notice. "Well," he said, "with that kind of growth, you might want to think about bringing in more senior leadership. People who've scaled companies before. Just something to consider." Even now, especially now, he couldn't just say congratulations. "We've got what we need," I said. "But thanks." He hesitated, then added, "Just trying to help. Don't get defensive." "I'm not," I said. "We're building something good. I know that now, whether you see it or not." I hung up first. Then I went back inside to the team, to the noise, to the celebration we'd earned. $5 million wasn't the finish line. It was the starting gun. The call came 2 days after the funding announcement hit TechCrunch. I was in the middle of reviewing a revised deployment schedule when his name lit up on my screen. I stared at it for a second, thumb hovering. I knew exactly what the call was. I picked up anyway. "Catherine," he said, using the full name like it meant something now. "I saw the article. $5 million. That's impressive." I waited, unsure where to put the word finally in my throat. "Thank you," I said, flat but polite. He cleared his throat. "I've been telling people, my daughter, the entrepreneur, I always knew you had a strong work ethic." That wasn't true. He'd told me to be careful, told me startups were reckless, told me not to expect rescue when things failed. Now he was rewriting history in real time, draping it in fatherly wisdom and selective memory. "I've got some ideas," he continued. "Contacts who've taken companies public, operators with IPO experience, people who can help you scale without losing focus. Maybe it's time to bring in someone with a little more polish. Doesn't mean you're not still the visionary." There it was. Pride laced with correction. He couldn't just say well done. He had to reach in, tweak the steering wheel, remind me that in his world, success still needed supervision. "We're scaling just fine," I said, keeping my voice even. "Marcus has the tech roadmap. Rachel's locked in ops. We're on track." "Catherine," he said, gently now. That tone, the one he used when I was 17 and decided against a state school. "You've always been brilliant with the product, but leadership at this level, funding, real investors, it's a different game. You don't want to be out of your depth when the stakes get higher. I'm not, I said. You don't have to prove anything to me, he added, which of course meant he believed I still was. I'm offering help. Let's not make this emotional. I almost laughed. Emotional was how he described anything I did that he didn't control. Passion? Emotional. Conviction? Emotional. Boundaries? Emotional. I appreciate the offer, I said, but we're doing this our way. He went quiet for a beat, then tried to recover with a chuckle. Well, you always were a little headstrong. Must run in the family. We both knew that wasn't the compliment he thought it was. After the call, I sat in my chair staring at the roadmap I'd built from nothing, out of code and conviction and nights no one saw. We weren't lucky. We weren't a fluke. We were ready. And we were ours. He could tell his version of the story if he wanted. I'd keep writing the real one. The first time someone said IPO, I thought they were joking. We were in a conference room that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's burnt coffee, sitting across from a partner at Redmont Capital. He'd just finished reviewing our client growth, churn rate, 0, and our revenue curve, which was starting to look like the kind of line founders lie about on LinkedIn. This, he said, tapping the graph with the back of his pen, is a roadmap to public if you want it. I blinked. We're barely 2 years old. And profitable, he said. With a defensible moat, IP you actually own, and a CTO who talks like a professor but ships like a pirate. Don't act surprised. You've built something most people don't. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the chart, watching the growth line stretch higher than it had any right to. It was real. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were becoming a problem. For the incumbents, for the overpriced consultants, for every bloated legacy system clinging to relevance. And they knew it. That week, 3 more firms reached out. 2 floated acquisition. 1 floated partnership that smelled like a slow takeover. I didn't take the meetings. I didn't need to. We were gaining leverage by the day, and I wasn't about to trade vision for a diluted exit. Still, the idea lingered. IPO. The letters felt heavy in my mouth. Not because I doubted we could do it, but because I could already hear my father's voice in my head. Going public, he'd say. You sure you're ready for that kind of exposure? Ready? I was overdue. Back at the office, I pulled the team into our scrappy little war room. Whiteboards packed with half-solved ideas, code scribbled next to financial notes, a space that still felt like it belonged to builders, not bankers. Rachel laid out the numbers. Marcus walked through the tech audit we'd need. Diana, our recently hired CFO, nodded like she'd been waiting for us to bring it up. We hit $30 million valuation this quarter, she said. If we keep pace, we'll double that by next year. That puts us in IPO territory. Not fantasy. Timeline. No one high-fived. No one popped champagne. That wasn't us. We just got to work. We tightened compliance, prepped audits. Diana rewrote our financial model twice in a weekend. Marcus started a full system stress test to identify any hidden fault lines. And me? I started preparing to be underestimated again, this time by bankers in suits who'd smile and say things like, founder energy, while asking if my CTO would handle the technical responses. Let them ask. Let them watch. Let them try to make sense of how a company built from a prototype on a secondhand laptop had made it to the starting line of Wall Street. We weren't there yet, but we were coming. The invitation came through my mother. Just a nice family dinner, she said. Your father made a reservation at that steakhouse he likes, Cascade Grill, private room. He thought it'd be good for all of us to celebrate. Celebrate what, she didn't say, but I already knew. We'd just landed our biggest client yet, and TechWave had run a feature calling us the dark horse of enterprise security. Suddenly, my father remembered he had a daughter in tech. I almost didn't go. I told myself I was too busy, too tired. that I had better things to do than sit through another round of Jason updates and thinly veiled advice about scaling smart. But some part of me still wanted to believe, naively, that maybe this time would be different, that maybe he'd just say he was proud and mean it. I wore a blazer. Jason wore a smug grin and a watch he probably hadn't paid for. My parents were already seated when I arrived, the table set with linen napkins and wine glasses too large for the pores they held. My father stood, pulled out my chair like we were in a play, and said, "The woman of the hour." I should have known. He asked about the new client, nodded thoughtfully when I explained our AI layer. Even took out his phone at one point to jot down something I said. Jason nodded along like he understood. My mother smiled like she was watching a commercial about a family who got along. "For years," my father said, raising his glass during the main course. "I've watched you build something incredible, Catherine. You've proven yourself, and I think it's time we talk about the next chapter." I froze mid-sip. This wasn't a toast. It was a transition. "The company is growing quickly," he continued. "The spotlight is only going to get hotter. And I've been speaking with some people, advisors, contacts, who think it might be time to bring in more seasoned leadership." Jason sat up straighter. My stomach dropped. "I've offered to help guide the next stage," my father said, "and Jason's shown real interest in stepping into a larger role, something that would allow you to focus on what you do best, technology, innovation." I looked at Jason, who tried to look surprised, then failed. His mouth twitched into a smile he didn't bother to hide. "You want me to hand over my company?" I asked, voice steady. "No one's saying that," my father said quickly. "But leadership is about recognizing when to evolve. This is a chance to elevate everyone." "Except me," I said. The silence that followed said everything. I folded my napkin slowly, placed it on the table. "Thank you for dinner," I said, "and for confirming exactly what I already suspected." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but I was already standing. "You've underestimated the wrong person," I said quietly. And then I left. Not angry, not even surprised, just done. The official meeting was set for Tuesday morning, but the real decision had already been made. That much was clear. The boardroom was colder than usual, the air stiff with silence that didn't quite feel professional. My father sat at the head of the table like it was still his company and not mine. Jason was on his left, in a tailored suit that didn't fit him as well as he thought it did. I took my seat across from them, spine straight, jaw locked. I already knew. I just hadn't heard the words yet. My father cleared his throat like he was announcing a weather report. "We've been reviewing the company's trajectory," he began, voice low and practiced. "The growth has been remarkable, Catherine. What you've done here, building this from the ground up, is something I truly admire." That word again. Admire. As if this were art. As if I hadn't bled for this company in server logs and sleepless nights. "But," he continued, "as we prepare for IPO, it's important to recognize what this next stage requires. Institutional investors expect leadership with a certain presence, a polish." Jason looked down, like he was trying to be humble. He failed. "We believe it's in the company's best interest," my father said, "for Jason to step into the CEO role moving forward." There it was. No warning, no vote, no discussion, just a statement. I could still hear the clink of silverware from the dinner where this had probably been decided. I didn't speak right away. Let the silence stretch, let the discomfort bloom around them. Finally, I said, "We?" "The board," he replied. "The board I assembled," I said, "with the investors I brought in, the product I built." My father leaned back, fingers steepled. "No one is questioning your contributions, Catherine, but the CEO role at this level comes with different expectations. Jason understands how to communicate with markets, with institutional players." "Jason can't read a cap table," I said. He can't explain our infrastructure. He's never written a line of code or sat in a room when a client threatened to walk. But he has a good handshake, so now he gets the crown. Jason finally looked up. It's not like that. It's exactly like that, I said. You'll remain CTO, my father added. Focus on what you're best at. And pretend I'm not watching my company handed to someone who's done nothing but coast off your connections? My father didn't flinch. Sometimes leadership means knowing when to let go. I stood slowly. You think you're installing a figurehead, I said, but you're severing the spine. Jason shifted in his seat. We want you on the team, Catherine. I looked at both of them. My father, with his legacy obsessions, and my brother, too weak to admit he was complicit. You don't want me on the team, I said. You want me silent. And I don't do silent. Not anymore. The formal vote was scheduled for next week, but the threat came early, wrapped in calm voices and phrases like mutual interest and smooth transitions. We met in a smaller room this time, not the boardroom. It was more private, more intimate, which made it worse. My father sat across from me with his jacket off and sleeves rolled up like we were just having a conversation. Jason stood by the window, pretending to check something on his phone, though I could see his hands shaking. We're trying to avoid disruption, my father said. There's no need to make this harder than it needs to be. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a transition agreement, CTO title confirmed, equity unchanged, a PR plan that spun the change as strategic and collaborative. I flipped through it, reading every word without reaction. If you stay in the company, remain CTO, and support this transition publicly, he said, we can protect what you've built. Your team stays intact. Your vision remains part of the product. And if I don't? I asked, not looking up. He exhaled slowly. The board will proceed with a vote to remove you entirely. If that happens, your position, your influence, everything is at risk. The narrative becomes one of instability. So either I accept being sidelined, I said, voice flat, or I get erased. No one's erasing you, Jason chimed in, like that somehow helped. We just need leadership that aligns with where the market is going. Jason, I said, finally meeting his eyes, you've been here less than a year. You don't even understand how the product works. I understand business, he said, trying for confidence. That's what matters now. I looked back at the folder. It was neat, professional, and clearly drafted weeks ago. This wasn't a decision. This was a plan. You're giving me a choice that isn't a choice, I said. Step down quietly, or watch you tear apart what I built, trying to replace me. Don't make this emotional, my father said. You're threatening to push me out of my own company. He didn't flinch. We're offering a way for everyone to come out ahead. No, I thought. You're offering a way for you to win cleanly. For Jason to play CEO without having to earn it. For me to disappear with a pat on the head and a press release that says gracious founder steps aside for growth. I closed the folder, stood slowly. Thank you, I said, for making things so clear. Jason looked confused. My father raised an eyebrow. I'm glad we had this talk, I added, because now I knew exactly what needed to happen and who I'd be when I was done. I didn't yell, I didn't storm out, I didn't send a midnight email or call an emergency board meeting. That's what they expected. That's what they were counting on. A burst of outrage they could call emotional, followed by a quiet unraveling they could reframe as not quite CEO material after all. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and thanked them for their transparency. I even shook Jason's hand, though it took effort not to crush his fingers. I played the part of the mature founder stepping back gracefully, the team player woman they always hoped I'd be, just cooperative enough to keep under control. And then I got to work. I started with the paperwork. Quietly, methodically. Reviewed every patent I'd filed, every licensing agreement we'd drafted, every clause in every client contract. I reread the IP protections my attorney had insisted on when we launched, the ones I'd nearly skipped because they felt unnecessary. They weren't. They were the spine. The product, the architecture, the core protocol. It was mine. Licensed to the company, not owned by it. Then I looked at our client list. 7 of our top 10 contracts included personal service clauses, relationships I'd built, technical oversight they demanded, clauses that named me specifically as a condition of delivery, the kind of clauses you only get when your reputation is the only thing holding your company up. Jason wouldn't know that. My father probably wouldn't care. But the board would. I started calling my leadership team one by one. Not to rally them, not yet. Just check-ins, conversations, quiet reads of the room. I asked about their workloads, their concerns, how they were feeling about the transition. I said all the right things. So did they. But under the surface, I could feel it. Discomfort, loyalty, fire. Marcus's response was the clearest. "I know you," he said. "You're not walking away from this, so whenever you move, just say the word." I didn't respond. Not yet. I began documenting everything, my contributions, my communications with clients, the timeline of key decisions. I saved files, created backups, logged conversations. Not because I was scared, but because I was preparing for a different kind of war. Not one waged in meeting rooms or inboxes, but in timing, ownership, and leverage. Every smile I gave them in meetings was calculated. Every silence was chosen. I didn't correct Jason when he took credit for things he hadn't done. I let the board think I was coming to terms with their decision. They thought I was folding. But I wasn't folding. I was loading the deck. Sarah Parker didn't ask questions when I texted her at 6:03 a.m. and said I needed to meet. She just replied, "My office, 8 sharp, bring everything." That was her way. No small talk, no soft landings. She'd helped me incorporate the company when I had nothing but a prototype, a whiteboard, and a stubborn belief that I could outbuild the competition. Her office was all glass and cold air, the kind of place that smelled like ink and war. She greeted me with a nod, a mug of black coffee, and a legal pad already open. "What's happening?" she asked. "My father and the board are replacing me," I said. "They want me to step down as CEO and stay on as CTO, or leave quietly." She didn't blink, just clicked her pen. "What's your ask?" "I need to know what I still own, what they can't take." We started with the patents. I pulled up the filings, most of them dated before our first round of funding. She scanned each one, cross-referenced them against the corporate filings, and gave a short, satisfied nod. "You filed these personally," she said, "then licensed them to the company. Smart. The core architecture is yours, Catherine. They can't claim it without your consent." A beat passed. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath. Next came the contracts, vendor agreements, client onboarding docs, term sheets, every scrap of legal binding I could dig up. She zeroed in on the personal service provisions. "These," she said, tapping her pen, "are golden. 4 of your biggest clients require your oversight. If you walk, they have legal grounds to walk too. They're not bound to SecureSync. They're bound to you." "What about equity?" "You're at 30%, fully vested. The board has majority, but with your IP and key clients, they lose more than you do if this gets messy. They'd have a company in name, not in substance." I sat back, staring at the ceiling for a second. Sarah closed the folder. "You have leverage. They can force you out of the title, but they can't force you out of the business, and they sure as hell can't build it without you." I nodded, slowly. "Then I don't want to burn it down." "No," she said. "You want to make sure that when they try to take it, there's nothing left worth keeping." Her words didn't feel cruel. They felt clean. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity. And now I had it. I stood, shook her hand. "I'll be in touch." "Catherine," she said before I reached the door. "They made this personal. You don't have to. Just be precise." I nodded. I would be. Starting now. I sat on the floor of my apartment with 3 folders open and a half-empty coffee cup going cold beside me. The silence was surgical. No music, no notifications, just the low hum of focus that used to feel like obsession and now felt like clarity. Page by page, I went back through every patent filing I'd ever submitted. Most founders hand this part off to legal and hope for the best. I didn't. I couldn't afford to. Back when I'd filed the first one, Core Flux Protocol 1.0, I was broke, unproven, and paranoid. I'd insisted on filing it in my name and licensing it back to the company, not because I thought I'd ever need to use that clause, but because something in me knew. Build it like someone's going to try and take it from you. That night, I saw the wisdom in my own caution. The licensing agreements were airtight. The patents weren't just provisional. They were already partially granted, with clear technical authorship under my name, and not just the CoreFlux engine, the data sync layer, the handshake framework, the load balancing algorithm that had taken me 2 months and 4 mental breakdowns to write. They were all mine, personally filed, personally owned. On paper, SecureSync had access, but the company didn't own a single piece of its foundation. I did. I flipped to the last page and sat back against the wall, knees bent, paper scattered around me like snow. They'd taken so much, my role, my authority, my voice in the room, and assumed I would take it like a good daughter. But they hadn't checked the source code of this entire machine. I was the source code. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. "I need you to review all the patent records again. Every clause, every line. I want them bulletproof." "They already are," she said, "but I'll go through them again." "Good," I said, "because they think they're about to inherit a company. What they're actually getting is an empty shell with my name still carved into its spine." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then she said, "This is when it shifts. You know that, right?" "I know." I hung up, closed the folders, and started cleaning up the papers. Not out of neatness, but out of preparation. If I was going to walk away, I wasn't walking empty-handed. I wasn't walking in defeat. They had built a plan based on the image of me, on my presence, my work, my reputation. But the substance? That was mine. And now I had proof. Let them keep the company. I'd already kept the soul. The first time I noticed it was in the Meridian contract, Section 6.2, Technical Oversight. It specified me by name, not just my title, not just company representative. It spelled it out. All system integrations, updates, and technical audits shall involve direct oversight by lead architect Catherine Reynolds. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. It made sense. I had built the architecture, negotiated the terms, sat across from their CIO, and answered every question without blinking. They wanted assurance. I was the assurance. But now, it was leverage. I started combing through every major client agreement. One after another, the same clause appeared. Different wording, same structure. Me, personally responsible for core deployment and ongoing advisory. Not the company, not a faceless team. Me. At least 5 of our top 7 clients had tied their contracts to my involvement. For some, it was buried in the compliance guarantees. For others, it was explicit. Subject to continued technical oversight from Ms. Reynolds, one read. Another had added the clause after a rough patch with a previous vendor, demanding a named technical lead to avoid being shuffled between junior consultants. I had been that lead. Jason wouldn't know that. He'd never sat in those meetings, never stood in a server room at 2 a.m. with an auditor breathing down his neck. He hadn't stayed up redrafting integration specs to meet a surprise regulatory update the night before launch. He'd never earned that kind of trust, but I had, and I had the signatures to prove it. I forwarded the contract excerpts to Sarah. She called 10 minutes later. "These are binding," she said. "If you leave, they can walk. No penalties, no breach." "Even if they try to assign Jason as a replacement?" She didn't even laugh. Jason wouldn't survive the first security review. I hung up and looked around my apartment. The whiteboards, the old prototypes, the server logs from our earliest builds. I remembered how each of those clients had come in, skeptical, cautious, and how I'd won them over not with glossy slides but with system diagrams and exact answers. I'd promised them stability, innovation, my eyes on their infrastructure. They hadn't signed with a brand, they'd signed with me. I pulled up the client list and began making quiet notes. Who I needed to speak to, who would understand first, who would ask the hard questions before I even had to explain. I wouldn't break NDAs. I wouldn't make threats. I wouldn't need to. They'd ask where I was, and when they found out I'd been pushed aside, they'd follow. Not out of loyalty, out of logic, because in this business, trust wasn't just currency, it was contract. And I was the contract. I started with Marcus. Not because I doubted him, he'd been with me since the prototype lived on a folding table, but because I owed him the truth first. We met in a corner booth at a bar 2 blocks from the office. He ordered his usual, black coffee, no matter the hour. "They want Jason as CEO," I said, skipping the preamble. He didn't blink, just stirred his coffee once, even though there was no sugar in it. "They think that'll fly?" "They think I'll stay on as CTO and smile for the press photos." He leaned back, watching me. "You're not staying." "No." He nodded. "Then neither am I." I didn't thank him. He didn't need me to. Over the next 3 days, I met with everyone who mattered. Not all at once, not in a war room, not with declarations. Quiet conversations, walks, coffee breaks, truth in small doses, delivered without drama. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. I watched their faces, read the shifts in posture, the flickers of understanding when they realized what was coming. Rachel was clinical. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked for timeframes, contingencies, equity implications. She was already 3 steps ahead, because of course she was. "They don't understand what operations holds together," she said. "They think it runs itself now that it's stable. I'll start drafting our exit terms." James, our lead engineer, looked physically ill when I told him. "I don't work for liars," he said quietly, "and I definitely don't work for Jason." Diana, our CFO, didn't react at all until I was done talking. Then she opened her laptop and said, "If we're doing this, I'll need clean copies of all financials through Q2, and I want outside legal on standby." Each one said the same thing in their own way. If you go, we go. Not with fists raised, not with banners and rebellion, with precision, with planning. The way professionals move when they've seen enough boardroom games to know how they end. No one asked for guarantees. No one needed promises. They remembered the late nights, the early bets, the way we'd built everything not from power but from trust. By the end of the week, the shape of the thing had changed. On the surface, nothing looked different. The office buzzed, clients got emails. Jason walked the halls like a man easing into power. But underneath, something had shifted. Not loudly, not yet. Quiet loyalty is the most dangerous kind. It moves in whispers, packs bags in silence, and when the time comes, it doesn't announce its departure. It just leaves and takes everything that matters with it. It was a Wednesday when the confessions started. Not dramatic declarations, not heated blow-ups, just quiet acknowledgments dropped like pebbles during hallway chats or in the pause after a Zoom meeting ended. "He talks a lot," one engineer muttered as we walked out of the server room, "but he never listens." "He called our roadmap cute," another said, eyes still on her screen. Then asked if we could add blockchain to the next release, for investor optics. In the lunchroom, Rachel slid into the seat across from me with a sigh and a smirk. "Your brother just asked if we could dress the dashboards up a bit for the Series B pitch. I told him we're in cybersecurity, not Sephora." The more I stayed quiet, the more people started talking. They weren't venting. They were choosing sides. Jason had been a joke at first. a harmless appendage trailing behind our father, asking surface-level questions, repeating phrases he'd heard in tech podcasts. He wore a rotating collection of sharp suits and always seemed to have a new big idea for repositioning our platform. Most involved buzzwords and none involved understanding the actual product. But now that he was stepping up, his obliviousness became something worse: presumption. He booked meetings without looping in leads, made suggestions to clients without clearing with ops, walked into stand-ups late, made jokes, then left with a vague comment about streamlining the funnel. He thought charisma could substitute for competence. Maybe it had before. But not here, not with this team. After a long dev sync, Marcus lingered behind as the room emptied. He pitched a new pricing model this morning, to the board. Didn't tell anyone on product, didn't run numbers, just tossed it in like it was a TED Talk. I nodded. You give the word, he said. I start extracting code branches for a clean handoff. You sure? He didn't flinch. I'm not building a future under someone who thinks dashboards are lipstick. Diana came by later with budget projections and 2 cups of strong coffee. She handed me one, then said, We're not following a last name, Catherine. We're following the one who actually built the company. They could have stayed silent, kept their heads down and waited to see how the power play unfolded. But they didn't. They found ways to tell me, in words and actions, that I wasn't alone. Jason had been handed a position. I'd earned loyalty. That's the thing about respect. It's quiet, but it echoes. And now, it was building into something I couldn't ignore. Not just frustration, not just resentment. A reckoning. I registered the name on a rainy Tuesday morning, fingers hovering for a second before clicking submit. Embersec, Inc. Clean, sharp, quiet heat beneath control. Not fire for destruction, fire for rebirth. It felt like claiming a truth I hadn't said aloud yet. I was leaving. And not just leaving. I was starting again. On my terms. This time, no one would mistake who was in charge. Sarah helped with the filings. She was meticulous, as always. Shell company first, limited disclosures, everything scrubbed for timing. You're not hiding, she said, tapping her pen against the desk. You're being strategic. I opened a new notebook that night, real paper, the kind I used during my MIT days when an idea first took shape. I sketched systems, team orgs, budget ranges, rollout phases, not just what we'd salvage from the old, what we'd do better. Cleaner architecture, streamlined onboarding, built-in resilience for scale. The patents were mine, the roadmap mine. The clients? Already asking quiet questions they didn't yet want to voice in a formal email. I didn't answer them, not yet, but I saw the paths forming. Marcus and Rachel met me after hours in the back of a Korean BBQ place we'd used as an impromptu war room during our first product launch. I slid the incorporation packet across the table. Embersec, Marcus read aloud. Not Phoenix? That's a myth, I said. This one's real, and it burns smarter. They smiled. Not approval. That wasn't necessary. Recognition. Diana joined a few nights later, bringing a bottle of cheap champagne and a list of finance tools that wouldn't tie back to SecureNet's internal systems. We toasted in silence. Not out of fear, out of focus. This wasn't a celebration yet. It was ignition. From the outside, everything at SecureNet looked the same. Jason was still giving updates to the board, still parading his way through departments like a new principal in a school that already ran fine without him. He talked about rebranding, about making the company friendlier to non-tech press. His latest obsession, a podcast appearance to boost founder optics. He didn't know that behind the scenes, the founder had moved on. Embersec started as a paper company with a heartbeat. But each day, it became something more. Sarah transferred the IP licenses under the new entity. Diana structured equity agreements. Marcus began sketching new systems that pulled from our legacy codebase but weren't chained to it. We weren't stealing from SecureNet. We were reclaiming what had always been ours. There was still a long road ahead, but we'd built from nothing once. This time, we weren't starting from zero. We were starting from fire. Late nights had a rhythm now. Screens glowing, quiet music humming, coffee cooling untouched beside me. While Jason gave interviews and pitched investors on dreams he didn't build, I drafted the infrastructure of my departure. Not just the emotional exit, I was preparing a surgical removal. Clean, legal, irrefutable. It started with a folder on my desktop named Archive 3, then quickly branched into a meticulously encrypted directory system only Marcus and I could access. Everything was labeled with clinical precision: IP chain, client retention, talent risk map, transition scenarios. Sarah had warned me, if you walk clean. No loose ends. No drama they can weaponize. So I built the folders not just for strategy, but for defense. Patent filings were organized chronologically, with source code snapshots and time-stamped commits proving authorship. Every file had hash verifications. If they tried to claim I'd stolen anything, the evidence would say otherwise. For our top clients, I documented every architecture meeting I'd personally led. Client decks, notes from whiteboarding sessions, even call logs, anything that made it clear. They didn't buy a platform, they bought my brain. Their systems ran because of decisions I made, not names on the org chart. The executive team helped without ever naming what we were doing. Rachel gathered HR contracts and flagged the change of control clauses I'd insisted on in the early days. Diana reviewed every budget line and built financial forecasts under 2 scenarios, one where we stayed and one where we walked. Her verdict: if we leave, we don't sink. They do. Marcus audited the entire codebase, tagging what was original versus what came post-funding. 70% of the core product, he said, tapping a line of Python like it was gospel, is based on the prototype you wrote at MIT. The rest? Extensions of it. Everything went into the contingency folders, not for leverage, for protection, for truth. Because when power shifts, narratives mutate. I'd watched too many founders, especially women, get painted as irrational, emotional, replaceable. I wouldn't give them the space to tell that story about me. At the bottom of it all, I placed a single-page letter, dated but unsigned. My resignation, calm, professional, legally airtight. The last line read, effective immediately, all licensing agreements not previously assigned to SecureNet revert to private ownership under Catherine Hale, as outlined in the founding IP clause. I stared at that letter for a long time one night, wondering what it would feel like when I finally printed it. Relief? Rage? Grief? Maybe all 3, but mostly it felt like clarity. I wasn't hoping they'd do the right thing anymore. I was preparing for what I knew they wouldn't. The mahogany conference table was polished to a sterile shine, as if reflecting the illusion of control made it real. I arrived 10 minutes early, out of habit, not for theatrics. Jason showed up 2 minutes late, phone still in hand, with a smile he had rehearsed in a mirror. Our father stood beside him, blazer crisp, expression unreadable, except to me. I knew that look. It was the same one he wore before he delivered bad news masked as strategy. The rest of the board trickled in, half nodding politely, a few avoiding my gaze. The chair, Eleanor, called the meeting to order with a voice as brittle as the silence that followed. Today's agenda, she began, is the executive restructuring proposal. Jason adjusted his cufflinks like he was stepping onto a stage. My father leaned back, confident. He already believed the deal was done. Eleanor cleared her throat. The proposal is to appoint Jason Hale as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Catherine Hale will continue as Chief Technology Officer. The titles landed like an afterthought. My name spoken second, like a footnote to my own story. They opened the floor. My father spoke first, praising Jason's external polish and market readiness. He framed it like evolution, necessary for scale. Jason followed, thanking the board for their confidence and claiming he would honor the vision Catherine started. I watched him talk about that vision like he'd ever understood it. When it was my turn, I kept my voice even. This board has the authority to restructure executive leadership. I acknowledge that, and I accept your decision." The room stilled. My father blinked. Jason paused, mouth slightly open. I smiled. Not wide, not sarcastic, just enough. Because they didn't understand what that smile meant. They mistook it for compliance, for surrender. They hadn't read the contracts. They hadn't traced the architecture. They hadn't seen the contingency folders labeled and time-stamped, the licensing clauses activated by this exact change. Jason looked at me like he'd just been handed a victory, like he expected me to shake his hand and pose for a photo. I offered nothing. "I trust the board will provide documentation of the new arrangement within the hour," I said. "I'll continue with my current responsibilities until transition planning is complete." My father narrowed his eyes. He could feel something wasn't right, but he didn't know where to look. He had spent so long discounting me, he'd never learned how to read me. The vote passed unanimously. Jason leaned back in the chair that had been mine, trying to wear the title like it fit. I stood calmly, gathered my notebook, and thanked the board for their time. They thought they'd won, but they had no idea what they had just lost. The office air felt thinner than usual, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked in that morning like I always did, early, focused, composed. My access badge still worked, my name still sat atop the glass office door, and yet everything had already shifted. Jason was CEO now, on paper, in headlines, not in substance, not where it counted. The night before, I'd sent a calendar invite titled Transition Planning, just 3 names, Marcus, Rachel, Diana. No agenda. They didn't need one. We gathered in my office at 8 a.m. sharp. No ceremony, no speeches, just the calm, practiced rhythm of people who had planned for this moment. Diana handed over a final checklist: asset logs, code-base tags, client relationship histories, all documented, dated, secured. Rachel had a communications packet ready, including personal letters to clients and a legal memo that outlined our non-compete safe zones. Marcus placed a sleek black folder on my desk. Inside, a single printed page, my formal resignation letter. I read it once more. No anger, no bitterness, just the truth, in ink. I, Catherine Hale, hereby resign from my position as Chief Technology Officer at SecureNet, effective immediately. The clause that followed detailed the termination of all technology licensing agreements triggered by a change in executive structure. The language was clean. The consequences were not. By 9 o'clock, I handed the letter to HR. No speech, no farewell bagels, just a polite, "You'll find all the documentation in this drive. My legal team is available for questions." At 9:15, I walked out of the building I'd helped design. The team leads I trusted followed, not in a dramatic exodus, but quietly, professionally, with files backed up and laptops returned. They didn't storm out. They stepped forward. Jason called me 3 times. I didn't pick up. At 9:47, Rachel sent the client transition emails. Every message included the legal shift in IP ownership and the formal launch notice of my new company, EmberSec. I paused outside the building for a moment. Not to reflect, not to cry. There'd be time for that later. I paused to feel the weight of calm defiance, the kind that doesn't come from rage, but from knowing you didn't just walk out of a company, you took its soul with you. They had replaced the nameplate on the door, but I took the foundation, the future, and the people who made it real. As I stepped onto the street, phone already buzzing with messages from loyal clients and friends, I felt no grief, just fire and clarity. It started with a blog post, small, niche, but sharp-eyed. A former engineer tipped off a cybersecurity newsletter that something had shifted at SecureNet. CTO Catherine Hale resigns amid leadership change, the headline read. 10 minutes later, a Reddit thread linked it to a sudden flurry of resignations from the engineering team. Within an hour, The story jumped to Tech Pulse, then Venture Watch. By noon, it was everywhere. My phone buzzed like it was short-circuiting. Journalists wanted statements. Former classmates sent wide-eyed messages. Investors called my attorney. SecureNet's PR team pushed out a carefully sterilized statement. We remain confident in our leadership and trajectory. But the silence from my end was louder. The industry didn't buy spin anymore. It smelled blood. Inside SecureNet, chaos bloomed. Clients weren't just calling, they were demanding meetings. The key accounts, the ones with my name etched into their contracts, weren't interested in handoffs or smooth transitions. They wanted to know why the person they trusted had disappeared overnight. Jason tried to do damage control with charm and buzzwords. "We're evolving," he told one CEO on a call that was quietly recorded and leaked. "It's about scale." But scale doesn't mean much when the architect walks out with the blueprints, and the builder, and the code. One client, a mid-size bank, sent a formal inquiry to legal, citing breach of contract. Another pulled out of an upcoming rollout, citing leadership uncertainty. Within 48 hours, 3 clients paused projects. 2 more requested renegotiation. Investors were next. One VC firm that held a sizable stake demanded an emergency board meeting. They hadn't been told about the internal power shift until the media broke it. That alone rattled confidence. But when they learned I'd taken the patents, and that key client relationships were contractually tethered to me, panic bled into fury. A leaked email from SecureNet's acting CFO surfaced on social media. The loss of Catherine and her team has materially impacted both our roadmap and perceived stability. We need to consider immediate strategic alternatives. By day 3, the story had a name: the Hale Coup. Tech journalists dissected every move: my departure, the sudden rise of my brother, the family dynamics laid bare under professional pretense. It was messy. It was compelling. It was page clicks and prime-time business news. Everyone had an opinion, and still I said nothing. No interviews, no social posts, just one quiet update. Embersec Inc. formally announced its incorporation and mission, a new frontier in adaptive security built by the minds that shaped the last one. The media spun. SecureNet staggered, and I watched the firestorm from my small, freshly painted office, as calm as the eye in the center of the storm. Let them burn. I was already building again. The elevator opened to the 10th floor with a mechanical sigh. No branding on the glass doors yet, just a small, taped-up printout that read, Embersec, Suite 1001. Rachel had made it on the office printer the night before. It was crooked, barely holding on, but it was ours. The office itself smelled like new carpet and unfinished ambition. Open floor plan, scuffed desks from a liquidation sale, whiteboards propped against bare walls. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough. Marcus was already setting up his workstation, sleeves rolled up, laptop open, earbuds in. Rachel had commandeered the tiny kitchen, organizing coffee supplies with her signature precision. Diana arrived minutes later, a stack of folders under her arm, and that quiet fire in her eyes. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same thing. We were home. At 9 o'clock sharp, we gathered in the conference room. A wobbly IKEA table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a window view of a rust-streaked building across the alley. I pulled out the Embersec product roadmap. Not hypothetical, not aspirational. A direct continuation of what we had already built, only cleaner, faster, freer. No boardroom politics, no whispered power grabs, just the architecture we believed in, refined with hard-won clarity. "This is day 1, I said, looking at each of them. Not of a reboot, of a resurrection. Rachel handed out printed cards, client onboarding sequences, press contact protocols, equity confirmations. Diana gave a quick rundown of financials, lean but solid, enough to survive our first 6 months without revenue if we kept the burn tight. Then Marcus connected his laptop to the screen and walked us through the demo environment. The Embersec platform, sleek, intuitive, already solving problems SecureNet had spent months skirting. This wasn't a beta. It was a bullet. By noon, the phones were already ringing. 2 clients called directly, not to talk, but to sign. Not tentative, not polite, eager. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not anxiety, not pressure. Momentum. We broke for lunch around 1:30, takeout Thai eaten at our desks. Rachel used the receipt as a napkin. Marcus accidentally spilled curry on a brand new Ethernet switch and cursed in 3 languages. We laughed harder than we had in weeks. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't glossy, but it was real. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting golden streaks through the windows, I stood quietly for a moment. We'd lost the boardroom, the headlines, the name. But not the soul. Embersec was never just a company. It was a line in the sand. A promise to build what mattered, with people who mattered, and nothing we didn't earn. Day 1 didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a return. The first call came just after 8 a.m. I was still halfway through my coffee, the office quiet except for the hum of Marcus's dev server. Diana picked up, and within seconds her posture shifted, straightened, alert. She nodded silently, then held out the phone to me with a raised brow. "It's Fairmount Bank's CIO, she mouthed. I took the call, already knowing what it meant. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're terminating our SecureNet contract," he said flatly. "We've read the coverage. We've seen who's still on their team, and who isn't." I waited, letting the silence fill the space. "You're the reason we signed in the first place. We don't want their name. We want your architecture, your oversight." "I'm not surprised," I said, "but I am grateful." He chuckled. "Let's just call it what it is. We followed the brains, not the branding. Send over the paperwork." By lunch, the legal team had finalized transition language. By end of day, Fairmount Bank, our largest and most visible client, was ours again. The second client came 24 hours later. Lakeview Trust had been more cautious in public, but the executive team had been watching closely. I'd met with them 2 weeks earlier, just before the official break, planting quiet seeds about new directions and deeper continuity. They hadn't said much then, but apparently they'd said plenty internally. This time it was their CTO on the line. "We were told you'd never walk away from SecureNet," he said, almost amused. "Guess no one thought to ask what would happen if the company walked away from you." They wanted our full stack, immediate migration, fast-tracked support, and most importantly, continued involvement from my team. Marcus was already on the whiteboard sketching the rollout before I hung up the phone. The switch wasn't just technical. It was symbolic. 2 of the largest institutions in our portfolio had openly broken with a $30 million valuation company to sign on with a brand new startup running on coffee, conviction, and a folding table. The ripple effect was instant. Emails started flooding in, former clients, prospective ones who'd been hesitant when we were just the upstart. The story had changed. We weren't rebels anymore. We were the professionals who'd survived the fire and built something stronger in the ashes. That week, I updated our homepage with a single new line beneath our logo. "Built by the team you already trusted." No bravado, no war cry, just the truth. And for clients who had watched the SecureNet fallout unfold in slow motion, that was all the reassurance they needed. It started with a tweet. A former SecureCore engineer, now 3 desks down from me at Embersec, posted a single sentence. "When leadership guts the soul of a company, don't act shocked when the body collapses." It went viral by noon. By the end of the week, it was clear the cracks in SecureCore weren't just cosmetic. They were structural. Their new CTO, a polished corporate type my father brought in to steady the ship, resigned after 13 days. No public statement, just a short note to the board and a leaked screenshot from a group chat. No product vision, no leadership, just panic. Investors weren't reassured. Clients began to circle their wagons. Those who hadn't already signed with Embersec started demanding meetings with SecureCore's new leadership. Most walked out of those calls less than impressed. Jason, in pressed suits and borrowed authority, struggled to answer even the most basic architectural questions. Internally, the rot spread fast. The product roadmap was a mess. Marcus had taken not just the tech with him, but the institutional knowledge. Engineers left behind were expected to reverse engineer their own system from scratch, without guidance, while fielding angry support tickets from clients who were now comparing their service to ours, loudly and publicly. Slack screenshots surfaced showing frantic exec messages. "Can someone please tell me what this client integration even is? And why wasn't I told these patents were tied to her personally?" PR tried to get ahead of it with a fluffy press release about fresh leadership and forward-thinking strategy. But the media wasn't buying it. Tech Times ran a headline 2 days later that read, "SecureCore's vision walked out the door and took the future with it." The article pulled no punches. It named names, quoted unnamed insiders, compared before and after product performance metrics, cited boardroom turmoil. For the first time in my life, my father was associated not with ruthless success, but with public failure. Jason, once the golden boy, was now reduced to defending decisions he never made and didn't understand. By the end of the quarter, the valuation had fallen from $30 million to under $8 million. Term sheets vanished. Client churn hit double digits. And through it all, Embersec grew. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their collapse wasn't vengeance. It was consequence. When you cut out the engine of a company, the innovation, the culture, the people who gave a damn, you don't get a stronger machine. You get a husk with a logo. And logos don't build trust. People do. The first clip surfaced on a Tuesday morning. Jason, mid-interview on a second-tier tech podcast, casually explaining how he developed the initial encryption protocols at SecureCore. I watched it in stunned silence, the words playing back like some alternate reality. Behind him was a wall of curated book spines and a corporate logo I once designed in my apartment with a free Canva trial. The host nodded along, clearly out of his depth, asking softball questions. But that single quote, Jason taking credit for tech he couldn't explain on a whiteboard, was time-stamped and clipped by a former engineer. Within hours, it was circulating on LinkedIn, Twitter, and every Slack channel even loosely connected to cybersecurity. By noon, our inboxes were full. Reporters wanted comment, clients wanted clarity. One venture partner at a major firm simply forwarded the clip with a 3-word subject line: "This is bad." But the real unraveling came when one of our early investors, a veteran in the space, posted a pointed rebuttal on his own blog. He outlined the history of the technology, the filing dates on the patents, my name, not Jason's, and detailed conversations from pitch meetings where Jason hadn't even been present. The title of the post was simple: "Founders Matter, So Does the Truth." After that, it wasn't just a PR issue, it was credibility erosion. More clips surfaced, Jason stumbling through technical questions on stage, offering buzzwords in place of answers. One live demo ended with him deferring to the product team and awkwardly laughing. Investors didn't laugh. Inside SecureCore, morale hit rock bottom. I heard from old colleagues still stuck there, engineers embarrassed to bring up the company name at industry events. Recruiters stopped returning calls. Jason doubled down, issued a non-apology on social media about being misunderstood and speaking metaphorically. But the damage was done. He became a meme. A side-by-side image started trending, Jason in his interview, and a screenshot of my MIT thesis, time-stamped and public, detailing the foundational concepts SecureCore was built on. The caption read, "One built it, one borrowed the story." My father went dark. No statements, no interviews. The last time I heard his voice was a terse voicemail asking if I'd consider helping right the ship. I didn't return the call. Jason, once handed the keys to a machine he didn't understand, now stood at the helm of a vessel taking on water from every side. He wasn't just unfit, he was a liability. And when your name becomes synonymous with stolen credit and collapsing trust, even a powerful last name can't shield you from the freefall. It started with a text, just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at it for longer than I'd admit. There was no sender name, just William Hale, still saved in my phone as if he were a contact I might one day need, rather than the man who handed my company to someone who had no idea what to do with it. I didn't reply. Not right away. The second message came an hour later. You're making this personal when it's business. Let's fix this. Fix, that word. As if this were a broken coffee machine or a bad quarter in sales. As if betrayal had a backspace key. By the end of the day, his assistant called my office to schedule a meeting. I told her I'd think about it. The truth was, I already knew my answer. But some part of me wanted to hear the pitch. We met at a quiet steakhouse downtown. Not our usual place, the one where he'd first told me Jason was taking over, but one nearby, familiar enough to sting. He was already seated when I arrived, posture composed, face a performance of concern and authority. "Catherine," he said, standing like we were in court. "Thank you for coming." I didn't smile. I didn't shake his hand. I sat, nodded once, and waited. "I'll get to the point," he began. "Jason's had a rough few weeks. He wasn't ready for the level of scrutiny. I may have underestimated that." It took effort not to laugh. That was his apology, admitting he miscalculated his golden boy's readiness, not the fact that he bulldozed his daughter out of the company she built from scratch. "I've spoken with some of the investors," he went on. "They're nervous. They think a partnership between SecureCore and Embersec might be mutually beneficial. Perhaps some kind of licensing agreement, maybe even a strategic acquisition down the line." I set my napkin on the table. "You want me to come back and save what's left of the mess you made?" "I want us to move past the drama. You proved your point. You're clearly thriving. This doesn't have to stay adversarial." Adversarial? As if I had started a war instead of surviving one. "I'm not interested in partnering with people who tried to erase me," I said evenly. "I'm not interested in fixing what you broke, and I'm not interested in pretending this was anything but calculated." His face twitched, anger, maybe shame, but he kept it buttoned behind his suit jacket. "You're making this emotional," he said quietly. "No," I said, rising. "I'm making it final." I left him there, surrounded by polished wood and empty intentions, sipping his scotch like it could dull the fact that for the first time, control was no longer his to reclaim. The term sheet arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, but the moment felt anything but ordinary. I stared at the email, the bold subject line stilling everything around me. Embersec. Final terms. 8 million, Series A at $50 million valuation. 6 months. That's how long it had taken us to go from a broken promise to a company reborn. The investors were a mix. One had passed on me during my first pitch at SecureCore. He didn't even try to hide his surprise when he called this time. "You made believers out of some tough customers," he said, "and built a product that actually delivers. I was wrong not to take you seriously before." I let the silence stretch just long enough to sting. Then, this time, we write the terms on my paper. Embersec was lean but potent. 27 employees, all hand-picked, all loyal. Every one of them had turned down offers to stay with SecureCore. They weren't here for stock options. They were here for the mission. And that mission now had fuel. $8 million was more than just a number. It meant real hires, real expansion. It meant no more holding our breath with every invoice. It meant allocating real resources to our AI-layered security infrastructure, finally pushing the roadmap forward instead of sideways. When the wire hit our account, I gathered the team in our still unfinished common area. No fanfare, just folding chairs, cold pizza, and a whiteboard covered in scribbles. I held up the signed term sheet. This money isn't our victory. It's a tool. The victory is what we'll build with it. There were cheers, of course. My team knew what it meant, but it wasn't about celebration. It was about momentum. Later that evening, after the office cleared out, I stayed behind. I pulled up our old pitch deck, the one I used when Secure Core was still mine, and laid it beside our current EmberSec roadmap. The technology had evolved, yes, but the vision? The core belief in smart, decentralized, low-latency encryption with human-centered policy control, that was untouched. They had tried to take the crown by force, but they never understood the kingdom. I sent one email that night. Short, direct. Subject, update. Body, EmberSec just closed an 8 Mullimer Series A at a 50 Mullimer valuation. Thank you for the motivation. I hit send, not to my father, not to Jason. I sent it to the one board member at Secure Core who had sat through that vote and said nothing. The silence that had spoken volumes. They all thought they were replacing me. What they did was release me, and I was just getting started. It started with a single headline buried halfway down the front page of a niche tech outlet. EmberSec rumored to explore IPO amid surge in cybersecurity demand. A speculative piece, mostly conjecture. But by the end of the week, the story had legs. CNBC picked it up next. From family fallout to market favorite, EmberSec's Catherine Voss might be the phoenix of cybersecurity. Phoenix. I didn't miss the irony. They had no idea just how accurate the metaphor was. We hadn't confirmed anything publicly. My team was instructed to neither deny nor engage. Let the speculation swell. Let them guess. That kind of mystery draws more attention than certainty ever could. Still, every call with clients ended with the same question. Is it true? Are you going public? Inside our offices, we stayed focused. The product roadmap was aggressive. Our AI-based breach prediction tool was close to ready. The team was growing at a controlled pace. Marcus had just closed a major contract with a European banking consortium that gave us a global foothold. Diana was deep in cash flow modeling and scenario testing. We were acting like a company headed for the market, because, quietly, we were. Still, reading the headlines stirred something complicated in me. The press had never cared much when I built my first company. I was the woman behind the tech, rarely at the front of the room. Jason had been the face, the mouthpiece. But now they wanted to tell my story, not just about the technology, but about the fire, the collapse, the rise. I walked into the office one morning to find a team member had taped a printed headline to my door. The Phoenix of Cybersecurity. In thick black marker, someone had scribbled beneath it, "Hell yes, she is." I smiled. Not for the title, but for what it represented. Recognition that came not from branding or spin, but from survival and proof. Every line of code, every contract, every hire had been a step forward. Not in spite of what happened at Secure Core, but because of it. Still, part of me stayed guarded. I knew what attention brought. Investors start circling for the wrong reasons. Journalists dig through your history like it's public property. People you haven't heard from in years appear with carefully worded congratulations and veiled requests. And then there's the pressure, the expectation that you'll not only live up to the myth, but outdo it. I wasn't here to live up to headlines. I was here to build. The rest was just noise. But I did allow myself one moment. One quiet morning before the office opened, I walked into our boardroom, stood at the glass wall that looked out over downtown Seattle, and whispered aloud, just once. "Phoenix, huh? Fine. Let's see how high she flies." He didn't make an appointment, just appeared at reception one drizzly Thursday morning, wearing the same slate gray suit he used to reserve for investor meetings. My assistant looked unsure when she buzzed my office. "Catherine, your father is here. He says he just wants a minute." I told her to send him in. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He walked in slower than I remembered. His posture was still proud, but his eyes didn't carry the same steel they once did. They scanned the space, clean lines, glass walls, the subtle hum of a company at full speed. A long moment passed before he said anything. This place is impressive. I leaned back in my chair. It works. He sat down across from me, taking off his coat with a deliberateness that felt rehearsed. For once, he didn't launch into advice or ask about numbers. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I was wrong, he said, just like that. I underestimated what you were building, not just the tech, but the leadership, the company. I thought I knew better. His voice had lost its usual sharpness, and I suppose I didn't want to admit that my daughter could outmaneuver me in the game I thought I mastered. It didn't feel like a grand moment. No swelling music, no tearful embrace, just words, late ones. I appreciate that, I said quietly. He nodded, as if expecting I wouldn't say more. But I'm not sure what you want from me now. He sighed. Maybe nothing. Maybe just to see it, to see you in it. You built something real, and I made it harder than it needed to be. My instinct was to fold into that. The part of me that had spent years chasing his approval stirred. But I'd learned too much. You didn't just make it harder, I said. You tried to take it from me. You chose someone else to carry my work forward, and he didn't carry it. He nearly crushed it. I see that now. His voice was low. I studied him. He looked smaller than he once had. The man who had taught me to fight now seemed tired of conflict. I'm not angry anymore, I told him. But I'm not building this for you. I'm not interested in proving anything. I'm just building. He looked around the room again. You're good at it. I know. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. If there's ever anything I can do, I'll let you know, I said. We both knew I wouldn't. He left without another word. I watched the door close behind him. There was no satisfaction in his apology, no vindication, just a quiet kind of clarity. I had become the person he never imagined, without needing him to say so. It didn't happen with a bang. No confetti or champagne corks popping in slow motion. Just a quiet ping on my phone. An alert from our lead investor, forwarding the latest valuation update. Embersec had officially crossed the billion-dollar mark. I stared at the number for a moment longer than I should have. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. We'd been flirting with unicorn status for months. The last 2 client deals had pushed us right to the edge, but seeing it in writing, black text on a white screen, felt surreal. I was officially bigger than the company I built and left behind. I walked out of my office into the open floor plan we'd fought to build. Not just the physical space, but the culture behind it. People weren't sitting in silos or hiding behind hierarchy. Engineers were in deep conversation with product leads. Ops and sales were troubleshooting a deployment together at the standing desk near the window. No one looked up when I passed, and I liked it that way. We weren't built around my ego. We were built around trust. Marcus was by the whiteboard with Ava, mapping out what looked like an ambitious security escalation flow. He glanced up when I approached and raised a brow. We hit it, didn't we? I smiled. We hit it. He didn't cheer, just nodded, the way people do when they've known something for a long time and are simply relieved the rest of the world caught up. Diana, ever practical, poked her head out of the finance nook a few minutes later. We'll need to adjust internal forecasting, and the press is going to want a quote. Give them something honest, I said, but not sentimental. The truth was, I didn't feel sentimental. I felt steady, grounded, maybe even a little defiant. The last time I crossed a milestone like this, at the old company, my name had been mentioned once at the end of a board call, sandwiched between plans to bring in more experienced leadership and a joke about golf. This time, there were no doubts about whose company this was. Across the city, SecureCorp limped along under a third interim CEO, their valuation barely a quarter of ours. I hadn't said a word about them publicly in over a year. I didn't need to. Our existence was the response. Later that night, when the office was mostly empty, I stood at the window watching Seattle glitter. I thought about all the nights I'd sat alone in my apartment, chasing a problem no one else could see. All the times I'd been told to be patient, polite, or less ambitious. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd finally caught up with the future I'd been building toward all along. And we weren't done yet. Not even close. The idea came quietly, like most of the best ones. It wasn't during a pitch meeting or a strategy session. It was after a coffee with a young founder who reminded me of myself 10 years ago. Sharp, hungry, polished in some ways, but raw in others. She had a prototype, a pitch deck, and a 1,000-yard stare that said she'd been in too many rooms where people smiled politely and said, "Come back when you've got traction." I recognized that look. I'd worn it, so I funded her. Quietly. No splashy announcement, just capital wired with a note. Build it your way. I believe in you. That night, I stared at the ceiling in my apartment and thought, how many women like her are out there? Technical, visionary, overlooked. How many are one yes away from building something the world hasn't seen before? Within a month, I launched the Ember Fund, a mentorship and micro-capital initiative focused solely on women founders who had been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside. No drawn-out application process. No demand for 10-year projections. Just a conversation, a pitch, and a promise. You'll be seen here. The stories came pouring in. A systems engineer who'd been passed over for CTO twice because she didn't have the right temperament. A robotics innovator who left her company after her male co-founder sold the tech without her consent. A biotech founder whose board had tried to force her out for optics. They weren't broken. They weren't bitter. They were builders, waiting for space to do what they did best. I didn't just write checks. I showed up. For office hours, calls, pitch reviews. I gave what I never got when I needed it most. Presence. When the invite came to speak at the annual Women in Tech Summit, I hesitated. I hated being labeled inspirational. It always felt like the polite cousin of patronized. But then I thought of that girl in the coffee shop, and the 50 others I'd funded since. Maybe it was time. The ballroom was packed. Spotlights, cameras, rows of bright faces, young, hungry, polished. I told them the truth. About building a company from a dorm room. About the dinner where my father smiled as he handed my company to someone else. About leaving, not empty-handed, but with every idea that had ever mattered. They tried to replace me, I said, letting the words hang. And then I smiled, steady and certain. Instead, they released me. The applause started slowly, then grew, then roared. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was rising from ashes. I felt like fire,